God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes he heals. Sometimes he moves mountains. Sometimes there is no doubt that God is working. But other times, he seems silent. Where are you, God? We cry. Be not far from me, we plead. The silence is mysterious. But the silence does not mean that God is absent. Over 2,500 years ago, while the Jews in Jerusalem were celebrating the rebuilding of their temple, thousands of Jews who remained in Babylon were threatened with genocide. And in that threat, God was silent. Not a word was spoken. Not a prophet was heard. But it did not mean that God was absent. Through the bravery of one woman, God saved a nation. This is the story of Esther.
So one of the things that's very common here at Lighthouse, and I talk about this all the time, excuse me, is that the Bible is this beautiful narrative. And it's more or less like an epic than anything else. And the interesting thing about this is that I think a lot of us, when we approach the Bible, we approach it like it's just like a bunch of conglomeration of different things, right? So you got the history books and the narratives, and then you got the law, Leviticus, super weird. So it's like, no, we're not gonna read that, you know? And then you get the Proverbs, and you're like, ooh, it's like a cookbook for spirituality, you know? And we do these things, and but we don't ever, when we approach the Bible, we struggle to see how it starts and finishes, right? Like how the whole story arc really plays itself out. And what's so incredible is that when you actually take a step back, and if you're a theology nerd, this is actually called biblical theology. It's this, how does the whole Bible communicate something? How does the story of God express itself in these words? And what's so incredible is that as you begin to dive into the Bible, you realize that God has been and always will be, from the beginning to the end, been in a process of taking what is ruined and bringing rest to it, taking what is chaotic and broken and messy and formless and something that just is outside of our control or whatever, and bringing restoration to it, bringing wholeness. It's literally the narrative of the entire Bible, and it actually starts with Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3. It's literally like the introduction to the heart of God is actually the creation account. If you are unfamiliar with how this whole story goes, in Genesis 1, God takes this universe, this cosmos, and it's described in the Bible as formless and void. That word formless and the word void doesn't mean that it was just like this glob, right? Like the earth was just like flowing around in the cosmos. That's not what's being communicated in that story. What's being said is that before anything, there was this chaoticness. There's this brokenness, and God, in his incredible act of love, decided to step into our world, our time, our reality, and he began to mold it and shape it. He began to take what was once chaotic and bring rest to it. And so what ends up happening is, as the story unfolds in Genesis 1 and 2, you have these days. And what's interesting is that if you actually read the days, they seem very confusing at first. You're like, how could one day have light, but then 4 days later it have the sun? And how could you have the moon and then this? And it seems so strange until you begin to realize that every single time God takes something and puts it in its place, it's actually God communicating to his people that he is bringing it to where it needs to be rested in. And what's so incredible, actually, is that in ancient Egyptian culture, the major kind of characters in Genesis 1 and 2, the moon, the stars, the sea, the sun, they were all personifications of the most wicked of gods in the Egyptian pantheon. They were the chaos creators, the ones that enslaved people. And what's so beautiful is that Genesis starts off by saying, God takes what may be ruined or broken or lacking in rest, and he forms it and breathes life into it and gives rest. It's the whole story of the Bible. And then as it continues, day 7 shows up, and it's very beautiful. God makes this day of rest. And I love how it's described there. It's not like day 7 shows up and God just imputes this law on humans and Adam and Eve, and he's just like, hey, day 7, you gotta like turn your alarm clock off and you gotta sleep in. That's not what he says. The text very clearly tells us that as God is molding and shaping and working with things, what he actually does and what he wants more than anything else is not to make us rest, but he wants to rest with us. He loves to take what is ruined and then rest with his people. This is literally, guys, the story of the Bible. The problem, though, is chapter 3 in Genesis, right? The fall. What ends up happening is what we do in our lives every single day that we think we're awesome. We start receiving this rest from God, and we start receiving this thing, and we get Eden, and we get joy, and we get this marriage, and we get this new family, we get this great new job, we got this new degree, and all of a sudden, things start looking pretty amazing, and then we start believing this lie that the rest that God wants to offer us isn't actually enough. And so we start going, I would rather have this version of rest in my life. I would rather have this autonomy to do what I want, to take control of what I want. And what ends up happening is absolute chaos, right? Like, this is the definition of your life. When you start to take control, what happens? Everything falls apart. Doesn't it? No? You guys are all perfect? Man, every time I try to impute my will upon my children and declare that this is what will happen, you know what my son Ezekiel does? The exact opposite. It's just like this brokenness of the fall, man. Like, we ruin. But what's so amazing is that God, after Genesis chapter 3, doesn't stop, close the book, and be like, dude, I'm done with humans. Let's wipe them off the face of the planet and let's like create some aliens. Like, he doesn't do that. Instead, what you see is the heart of God. The heart of God that continues to unfold throughout the entire Bible, where every single time humans ruin our lives because we are not content with what God has for us, every time God, in an undeserved, beautiful, audacious way, scandalous way, walks in and offers rest. This is the story of Noah and the ark, chaos, brokenness, but then rest. This is the story of God's people, even though they were defiant and did not want to go to the promised land. Eventually, he gives them the promised land and gives them rest. This is the story of Jesus to every single one of us. And what's so cool, guys, is that as we are entering into Esther chapter 9, this kind of final Sunday that we're in this book, the same thing is happening. We're entering into a story where the people of Israel, and in particular Esther and Mordecai, have overstepped their boundaries on what they believe was rightfully theirs. They start overreaching and overreaching and overreaching, ruining their lives, and yet God enters in with rest. It's one of the most beautiful stories that I think that I've seen in the Bible in a long time, because it's so ridiculous. It's so crazy. Now, what you're going to notice as we jump into chapter 9 is I'm only going to read basically from 9 through 18. From that point on and into chapter 10, the author of Esther dialogues about this tradition, this festival called Purim. And the festival of Purim is actually not a festival that was dictated by God, approved of by God, or was ever a festival that Jesus ever even acknowledges in the New Testament. It's one of those traditions that the Jews kind of like take on for themselves, but they never actually get the stamp of approval from God for it. So if you're very interested in Purim, just read through it and you'll realize like, wow, this is interesting. Every other tradition is dictated by God, but not this one, which means maybe they were doing the wrong thing. You never know. So we're going to be reading verses 1 through 16 to kind of see the history set up here, and then we'll talk about ruin and rest. Look at this, verse 1. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. So this edict was that all of the Jews in the Persian Empire were now at a point where they were allowed to kind of go on the offensive a little bit in a military piece. And I'll talk about that a little bit later when we're done reading. But this edict was a declaration of war, so to speak. So the command of the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities and all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them. This is talking about the Jews. Because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces and satraps and governors and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. And they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. So in the central city of the Persian Empire, they went to war and 500 Persians were killed by the Jews. They also killed, and these are the names of people affiliated with Haman. I'm going to botch them, I'm sorry, but they're very complex names. So just give me some grace here. Verse 7. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Iridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vasathai. Great. Verse 10. The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jew. But they did not lay hands on the plunder. I want you to notice that statement comes up a couple of times. If you're in Bible, underline that. They did not lay hands on the plunder. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. So he's having an interaction with Esther. Now that this kind of mini war has broken out in his own hometown, he's talking with the queen and he's like, hey, let's have a dialogue. The Jews have killed 500. You've got your revenge on the 10 sons of Haman, your worst enemy. Give me an update. How are things going? What else needs to happen here? The king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? So what's going on in the rest of Persia about the Jews and the Persians? Now, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted. So he's saying, is there anything else that needs to be done? Are you happy? Verse 13. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles. So she says, hey, one day of war is not enough. I want us to continue to fight. And in addition to that, I want to take those 10 guys that were affiliated with my enemy and I want to stick them on poles, shove their bodies on them as an act of dishonor to them. This is what Esther asks. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men. So another 300 die the next day. But they did not lay their hand on the plunder. Again, that weird statement comes up. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces, so this is all of the Jews throughout the Persian Empire. This isn't just in Susa anymore. We're talking about the whole area, Egypt to Susa, so to speak. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. Stop there. So what we have going on here, guys, is a continuation of this whole dialogue we had last week with this war type of edict that was written by Mordecai. If you guys are unfamiliar with the story, Esther, Queen Esther of the Persians, was actually a young Jewish woman living in secrecy. So she had been chosen by this Persian king, his name is Xerxes. She was made the queen, and her cousin Mordecai, who was also kind of her adopted dad, had come up into the ranks of the Persian Empire to the point where they were very prominent. They had a lot of great leadership, they had a lot of things going on. However, Esther always kept her Judaism a secret. She just said, I don't want anybody to know, and Mordecai even told her, don't tell anybody. The problem, though, was that there was one guy in the Persian military. He was kind of the right-hand guy to Xerxes. He was not Persian. He was actually an Agagite. And what's interesting, this guy's named Haman. Haman absolutely hated Mordecai. They just had this feud with each other. And it wasn't just like a, I hate you, you hate me kind of a thing, and we're just gonna battle it and whatever. The problem is that because Haman was an Agagite and Mordecai was a Jew, they had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of racist, racial tensions where these two groups of people fought each other to the death for hundreds of years. They hated each other. And so Haman, because he was a top leader in the Persian government, he went, I am going to kill every single Jew in all of the world. He was the Hitler of his day. He went, I'm sick of Mordecai. And you know what? I'm sick of all the Jews. So he wrote a law to kill every single Jew on a very specific day in history. Now, what's interesting is that Esther, keeping her Judaism a secret, puts the king and Haman and Esther in this odd situation. If Haman is going to kill every Jew, that means, by implication, that he is going to kill the king's wife. He's going to kill his boss's wife because she's a Jew. Not a good thing, right? Like, you don't want to kill your boss's wife. You'll get promoted, or not promoted, you'll die. Like, it's not a good thing. So he's like, uh-oh, this is not good. The king finds out about it. They stop the whole plot. Haman is killed, and you would think everything is going well. And King Xerxes looks to Mordecai, and he goes, man, like, I want you to be able to take care of your people. I want you to be able to fend for them, because this edict was for them to all die. And so he says, let's reverse this law. Let's write a new amendment. And this is what we talked about last week. They have all the freedom in the world to write a brand new law to save their people. Literally, the king of the greatest empire in ancient history is telling Jews, write whatever you want. And I made a joke last week where if someone told me I could write any law I wanted, no matter what, the first thing I would write was what? Chick-fil-A open on Sundays, right? Like, this is just, you're just gonna write something extravagant. The problem is that Mordecai, and by the way, Chick-fil-A is not open on Sunday, so don't expect, it's not gonna happen, right? You're gonna go get Chipotle or something later. So Mordecai, this is the problem though, we learned this last week. Mordecai has the freedom to be able to write a law to save his people. And instead of writing a law to save his people, he writes a declaration of war. He writes a law that says that they can absolutely destroy on the offensive to kill anybody who gets in their way. He writes a law saying that they can plunder whatever they want. The word plunder literally means to decimate, destroy, not just the men, women, and children of a different civilization, but also to kill off their animals, their livestock, to burn their houses to the ground. It was a way of saying, we have dominated you. Mordecai goes out of his way, outside of the bounds of what we know God wants for his people to be people of peace, and he declares war. And then what we just read is that war. They show up. Mordecai is kind of like walking around, kind of like a king-like figure. He's got a crown on, he's got a robe on, and all of this murder starts happening. You have 500, then you have 300, and then they wonder what's going on throughout the whole nation. 75,000 people are killed in a 2-day span. And what's so sad about this entire situation, guys, is what the author is implying to us, not explicitly, but implicitly. Over and over and over again in this text, people's fear of Mordecai is emphasized, not their fear of God. Over and above everything else, all of these people who are of different nationalities. And I don't want you to assume, oh, it's all Persians. Persians are all being killed and they're all bad people. No. The Babylonians destroyed the Jewish people, the Israelites. They also destroyed the Ugaritic. They also just fought off the Medes. And then the Persians came in and then they took over the Medes. And so what you've actually got in Persia is this melting pot of enslaved people who have no choice. There's the elite and then there's the rest. Innocent people are killed. Innocent people are murdered. It's this horrible situation. And the text just tells us over and over and over again that when Mordecai gets great power, everybody fears him, and then ruin ensues. Destruction comes. Do you know what this is describing? Our lives. Literally. If you think about your life for just a moment, I'm not saying you're Mordecai, right? But if you are, you need to stop that now, right? Like, we don't have the power to write a decree to go to war. But what Mordecai is doing is what humans have been doing since Genesis 1. There's an option for peace, an option for this being able to be with God and to be favored by God, and then there's a lack of acceptance of that. Mordecai goes, I want vengeance. I want more than what God's gonna provide. And so he oversteps and he oversteps and he oversteps. And then what ends up happening is ruin starts to follow him. This is what we all do. This is literally what all of you do. This is what I do. Every day of my life, I grab hold of something that I think is rightfully mine, thinking that it's the thing that's for me. This is a gift from God. This is my life. This is my marriage. This is my school. This is my whatever. And then I kind of live my life and it feels chaotic and broken and I don't feel at peace and I feel like something is deeply wrong, but I'm never quite evaluating my circumstances. And then I look back and I realize that all of my, like what's behind me is just being destroyed. This is what we do. This is how we lose friends. This is how you think you're in absolute control of your bank account, and then you eventually you log in and then you realize that you're totally in debt, right? Grab. You do all of this, and the saddest thing about this entire circumstance is not once is Mordecai asking God what he wants. Not once is Mordecai asking a priest or he's just going. Why? Because he thinks that he is the wisest man in his life and that this is the way to do it. It's what we do. If you're married, you do this in your marriage. You do it all the time. You grab, you go, this is what I'm gonna do. This is what I think is right. This is how I think that we should do conflict resolution. This is how I think like this. You don't even think about asking God what he wants for your marriage at all. And then you're just kind of doing life for a couple of months and then you look back and you realize, oh my gosh, am I a week away from getting served divorce papers? Do it with our children. I'm gonna discipline them this way, and I'm gonna make them learn this way. I'm gonna impute this expectation that I have on them, and I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna overstep all of my bounds of power. And then I'm gonna look back and realize that my kids don't want anything to do with Jesus. They don't want anything to do with me. They're in the wrong crowds, and I have ruined them. Guys, we love to overreach. We love to assume, to presume that God is freely offering us power when he's not. Mordecai over and over and over again does something completely inappropriate. And I know that some of you, I actually had a couple of questions last week. Some people were like, how do you know that what Mordecai wrote is wrong? Because it's a great question, right? Josh, are you just making this stuff up? Are you just a peacemaking guy and you just want to impute that into the Old Testament? No, I'm not. I want you to look at Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 7. This is going to be up on the screen. This is how I know that this is not what God wanted. This is a very interesting passage. So Jeremiah contextually, a lot of us love Jeremiah 29:11, right? It's the famous, I'll bless you and your life's gonna be great. We put it on coffee mugs and we don't ever understand the context of that verse. This is the same chapter, okay? What happened historically with the book of Jeremiah is that the Israelite nation was in Jerusalem. They had been separated because of their own sinfulness. They have literally become a non-unified nation, and the northern kingdom got destroyed. The southern kingdom was struggling, but they were living in sin. And so there was this prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah kept coming up to him over and over and over again. He was a prophet that, to be honest, was the worst job in the world. He had to tell God's people that they were sinful over and over and over again. And God even told Isaiah, I am going to send you to speak to a hardened people, and they will not listen to you, by the way. So Isaiah's job was basically to talk to a wall for his whole life. Miserable. So Isaiah tells the Israelites, you are going to be destroyed. Your sinfulness is eventually going to corrupt you to the point where God is going to allow Babylon to ruin you. And it happens. They are destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. They are exiled, okay? They are sent to Babylon. Babylon then gets destroyed by the Persians. But all the while, so this is literally during the time of Esther, there is a prophet by the name of Jeremiah, and he is back in Jerusalem. He's sitting back. He was not exiled. A lot of people actually think he was too old, like he wasn't a profitable person to take with. So he's just going to be left to die in Israel. And Jeremiah begins to write letters to the Israelites who are in Susa. And this is what he tells them. This is so interesting. This is when they are getting ready for war, and this is what he writes. He says, also, as you're away, as you're exiled, as you've lost everything, seek the peace. Do you know what that word peace is in Hebrew? Shalom. The holistic redemption and kingdom of God. Seek the presence and glory of God and prosperity of the city. What city is he talking about there? He's talking about Babylon, which Babylon, after they were destroyed by the Persians, that whole region became Susa. This city that 800 people were murdered in one day. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. You know how convicting that is? Every one of us, when our life feels like it's in exile and ruin, what do? We instantly assume, man, that like there's just like some weird thing happening. Like, oh man, I must be messing my life up, or something's going on, or I don't know, it's just bad luck that like my life is in shambles. No, your life more often than not, is completely ruined because God put you there to humble you. We don't like to say that, right? In American Christianity, like all of us want to hear that Jesus loves us and everybody's happy and he's just going to give you like gold, right? Well, not gold, like likes on Instagram or something. But like Jeremiah is telling the people of Israel, God is going to send you because you are broken. And you need to learn a lesson. And while you're in this city that I have carried you into, you better bring the shalom of God. Peace and prosperity. And not only that, pray to the Lord for that city that you hate so much. Because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Jeremiah is listening to God. God, speak to me. God, hear me. Like, I want to hear your voice and I want to tell the people of God. Mordecai is sitting there going, I don't need to hear the voice of God. I want a sword. And the difference between the two is war and rest. The reason why I'm telling you that what Mordecai is doing is an overstep of his power is because the Word of God tells us it is. This is not the design of God. He wants peace. He wants rest for all of humanity. This is the Abrahamic covenant. He says, I will make you a blessing, talking to Israel, so that you may be a blessing to the nations and to the world. What Mordecai is doing is he is reaching and he is bringing ruin into his life. And he's bringing ruin into the people of God. This is chaos. How many of you feel like you are in control and yet completely out of control? It's our life, right? How many of you feel like you almost every day step into battles that you were not ready for? Chances are you have a heart like Mordecai. I'm not going to listen to God. I'm just going to go. And God's like, what are you doing? How many of you feel like you are making decisions and you aren't sure if they're the right or the wrong decisions, and all you're hearing is the silence of God, and so you presume that the silence of God is his approval, but when in fact the silence of God may actually be his disapproval of you? God, please tell me what to do. Please tell me what to do. Please tell me what to do. And you're like sitting there and you're like, I've got two options, but you keep like walking towards the right one, right? You're like, God, I'm lead me wherever you want me to go. Well, I'm here, I guess. God, bless me where I'm at. What? We do that, don't you? I'm gonna put out 2 resumes, right? But I really hope I want that one. So I'm gonna pray diligently for this one. And then if this one happens, I may, and then you get that job and you're like, God! There's only like 6 millennials in the whole room, right? That's what we do. I'm 30, I'm a millennial. I'm like, what the heck, God? I thought you were my best friend. We are in the business, guys, as humans. This is us. This is the definition of our culture. We are in the business of ruining the peace of God and then getting upset with God when we don't feel at peace. This is what our world is, man. This is what politics are. This is what government systems do. Everybody wants peace. Everyone wants to blame everybody else. No one wants to admit that maybe, just maybe, they're ruining their own lives. And we need the peace of God. And so what is God's response to this? What is God's response to Mordecai being absolutely foolish and then the people of Israel doing something they shouldn't do? Well, he gives them rest. Gives them rest. Before I read verse 17, this was a thing in my notes. I wasn't sure I was going to say this. You know how I told you to keep underlining the fact that the Jews never took the plunder? You know, what's interesting is that in Mordecai's initial letter, he actually demanded that they had to. So when you take plunder, that meant that you were destroying everything. It was a way to shame people. It was a way to say, we own you and you stop it now. And what's so fascinating is that all of these Jews get this declaration by their leader to plunder, but they can't. And as you read that, if you just enter into the story for like 2 seconds and put your emotions into it, like it makes so much sense. There is a guy that they have not met because he lives in Babylon and Susa, and they're back in Israel and they're back in wherever. And this guy is telling them, destroy, 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 destroy. And they're like, bro, we just got destroyed by the Babylonians and we just got destroyed by prayer and we don't want to go to war. We want to go. And they're torn and then they fight and then they're supposed to plunder and they're like, I don't know if I can go that far. You can even see that there's a tension even in the people of Israel. They're like, we don't want to, like we'll take one step, but man, I don't know if I can go the whole step. That's called conviction. You know that, right? When you're invited by people to do something you know that's wrong and you take like one little step and then you're like, oh, that was not of God. But then most of us go, but I'm a people pleaser, so I'm gonna take another one. I used to do this when I was a brand new Christian all the time, hang out with all of my Christian friends. And like, we'd end up just like getting high and drunk and we were still sleeping with our girlfriends and doing all these things, but like we still like loved Jesus. And it's just kind of this slow capitulation into sinfulness. And it's just like, but it's amazing. The Jews aren't plundering. You can already see that they're drawing a line even with their own leader. So it's fascinating. But going back to what God does for them, look at this in verse 17. This happens on the 13th day of the month of Adar. And on the 14th day, writers in the Old Testament, they love sevens. It's just a form of completion. They love it when 7 days passes. On the 14th day, they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th. And then on the 15th, they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. When I was 19, so some of you know my story. I became a Christian when I was 18 years old. When I was 19, I started going to this church down in Colorado Springs. And shout out to the Baggett family if you guys are here, Kyle and Zach. But so I started going to this church. And it was a pretty large church, like 2,000 people. They had a huge building. And I was walking around with this guy who was a mentor of mine, and we were walking around the building, and I was there on like a random day, and I think it was just like, he was just mentoring me, and we were like walking. He loved to walk, and he's like, man, well, Jesus walks, let's walk. And I was like, bro, can we get in a car and drive to Chipotle or something? Like, what are we doing? We just walk around. And one day we were out in the back of the building, and they had basketball hoops, and we walked around. And when we got to the front of the building, I kind of turned and I saw the front entrance, and all of a sudden I just heard this noise. And it sounded like people were weeping, like mourning. and then also laughing. Like, have you ever heard that mixture? Like deep mourning, but then like celebrating and laughing. And I was just like, just totally weirded out. I was like, okay. And then, but I saw the people coming out of the building, and there was like 5, and then 10, and then 20, and then 50, then 100, then 200 people. Like, they're all walking out, mourning and weeping and laughing and celebrating. And I was like, what is, guys, I'm like a brand new Christian, right? I don't grow up in the church. So I was just like, what is this like magic thing? Like, what is this, like Wiccan stuff? What's going on? And like, things. But all of them I noticed were carrying balloons, and they had blue balloons and white balloons. And they all walked out crying and celebrating, and then all of a sudden they praise God for the eternal rest that he gives us, and then they threw the balloons up. And I feel like such a loser because I didn't know what was going on. So I was like, hey Wes, what was that? And he was like, bro, that was a funeral. And I had grown up, like the funerals I had grown up going to, you all wear all black, you walk in, everybody cries, and then everybody does the funeral thing, and then you all leave crying, and then you go and have like a snack at a house where everybody still cries, and then everybody just leaves. That was my view of funerals, like the worst experience of my life. But I was sitting there watching people like rejoice in the midst of their ruin. Like shouting for joy and yet also weeping. And then they were declaring the rest, the eternal rest of God. And I just was like, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen in my life. Like I'd never seen that in my entire life. And that oxymoronic feeling of ruin and rejoicing and like being torn to weep and yet also resting is literally like, guys, that's what you should feel when you read these verses. Like, think about it. This war was not justified. We know for a fact in Jeremiah 29:7, this was not what the people of God were supposed to do. Mordecai is never revered ever in the New Testament. He's not even mentioned. Jesus never talks about him. The writer of Hebrews, when he talks about this pantheon of incredible leaders of the Jewish faith, not once, dead silence. This is not like, and when you read this, and if you were reading it and you're going, oh my gosh, and I don't think that's okay, and I don't think that's okay, and then you get to verse 17, and then they rest, and it's the same word being used all throughout the Bible when it talks about God's rest for his people, and how Jesus gives us rest when we come to him and when he beckons us. Like, if you're like me, you're just like, man, they don't deserve that. Like, they just killed 75,000 people. Do they get the right to rejoice? Without praising God, without praying to him, without celebrating him, it's just all about them? No. And it makes me so mad until I realize that what they're experiencing is the ridiculous scandalousness of the gospel of Jesus. Like, guys, this is the cross. We ruin our lives. We make horrible mistakes. We turn from God. We don't listen to him. We take ownership of our own circumstances. We look in the rearview mirror. All we see is ruin. And then Jesus stands before us and he says, can I give you rest? Can I forgive you because I love you? Can I restore to you all of the brokenness that, man, you just keep doing in your life? And sometimes it just like makes me so angry at how scandalous God is, doesn't it? Like, man, like I don't want that person to experience the grace of God. But then I think, but I experienced the grace of God. But I was forgiven of my brokenness. Like, I'm just like, man, if I was Mordecai, it would have been worse. The laws that I would have written, way worse than him. Same for you. Think about all the vindictive things that you think about with that spouse that left you, or that friend that's no longer with you, or that teacher that gave you an F, or that whatever it is, that kid that ran away, and that you just so want your prodigal son to come home, and yet you're also so infuriated. Think about all the vindictiveness that's in your own heart. We all do what Mordecai does, and yet they get to celebrate, they get to be full of joy, and they get to rest. man, like this whole week I've been sick, one, because my children are just like walking boogers, like it's just ridiculous. But like this whole week, guys, like I'm not joking, Monday, like literally from last Sunday till last night, my life, it's just like, just ruined. If you met me, I was on edge. My wife and I got in some of the worst arguments we've had in a long time. Like the burden of us moving in August is just like destroying me. Like, and I'm sitting there and it was so funny. I was sitting there on my couch last night reading this, angry once again at Mordecai, and I'm sitting there and I was just like, oh Jesus, thank you for taking my ruin and offering me rest. Like, I don't deserve it right now. None of you deserve rest right now. You do know that, right? Like, you want it so bad, but you don't deserve it. And the greatest news of Jesus Christ is that he's lavishing it on you, that he's offering it to you. Like, that's the goodness of the gospel. You came in wanting something and then you don't deserve it, and God's gonna go, hey, here you go. There's 3 things I wrote down. I'll finish with these today, but there's 3 things that I was just like journaling all week, and I was just like, man, this is what I'm feeling, and I feel like I'm a pretty normal human. I'm not a superhuman by any means, and so I thought, man, if I'm feeling these things, I can guarantee you our church is feeling these things, because you're all normal humans too, right? So these are 3 areas of ruin and 3 things that I think need to struggle through, but scriptures that give us hope. So maybe you'll resonate with this. 1, when you feel like the ruin of your life is subsiding, but it's not finished yet, and you don't know if you can rest, there's a tension there, right? You ever felt that? Like you're just, like you feel like life, chaos, my sins, my addictions, all these things, and it's just like way over your head, and you're like, I'm done. And then all of a sudden, things start subsiding like just enough, and it's like right here, and you're like, oh, I can breathe for the first time. Oh, thank you, Jesus. There's a weird tension that happens, I think, for a lot of us, that when that level of water, of ruin hits, I don't think that we think we're allowed to rest yet. Because I think we just assume, well, I got to wait till all of it's completely gone, you know? Like, I'll figure that out when I graduate from my medical program 9 years from now, right? Got you guys over here. PT program, right? 4 years of, So, like, just, and it's so cool. Look at this. This is Genesis chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. This is the story of the very first time that God deliberately ruins and then gives rest in the Bible. 8, 1 through 4. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark. And he sent wind over the earth. And the waters receded. Waters in ancient culture were always assumed as being a darkness, like a turmoil, chaotic kind of experience. Waters were bad. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky, so now judgment is no longer happening. The waters receded steadily from the earth. You ever felt like things start kind of calming a little bit in your life? Oh man, I feel like God may be doing something. At the end of 150 days, the waters had gone down, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, however you say that. You don't know how to say it either, so whatever. Everybody assumes pastors know how to say words, and we're totally making them up, by the way. I love that imagery. Like, because I think that I can't rest until it's all done. But as the waters are receding, the ark rests. And maybe you need to know today that like Jesus is inviting you to take a deep breath, even if you still feel like you're in ruin. Just, okay. 2, when you feel like Jesus doesn't want your ruin, and man, I feel like this all the time. When Jesus doesn't want your ruin, but all you want is for him to give you rest. Is this the lie that we believe? Like, right? Every one of us believes Jesus doesn't want any of our junk. He's like, I'm too busy with like real things, right? Look at this, Matthew chapter 11, verse 28 through 30. Oh, it's so beautiful. Come to me. That is a command. That is not a save the date for a wedding. Like, hey, you can think about it or not. You know, like you get that email from that random friend from college and you're like, do I have to go? That's not what this is. This is called an imperative command. He says, come to me. Come to me is what Jesus is telling you. All you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, which means live with me, learn with me, kind of sync up with me, and learn from me. For I am, these are words that I often do not think Jesus is. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. He's saying when you are with me, the deepest piece of who you are will feel so restful when you come to him. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Don't believe the lie, friends, that all of this ruin makes you unapproachable with God. He's inviting you. Third, last, when you feel like life is too chaotic and you've been working too hard, that there's no way that you can find rest with Jesus. Is there any threes on the Enneagram in the room? Yeah, there's no way I'm the only one. Raise your hand, threes, be proud. Oh gosh, okay, so I'm the only workaholic in this whole church here? Come on now. Mark 6, verses 30 and 31. Check this out. Oh, this is so beautiful. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, come be with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest. Context. The apostles were just sent out 2 by 2 to go heal the sick, cast out demons, and to preach the gospel, to do miracles. Those are exhausting things. I've only done one, preach the gospel. I have never casted out a demon or, healed the sick. I assume that's an exhausting experience, right? But they're going and they run back to Jesus in the Gospel of Mark. They run to him. They're like, whoo, Jesus, you would have no idea. Like, it was unbelievable, bro. We did so much. And then there's this crowd coming and all of this work needs to be done. And the to-do list of Christian spirituality is like, all of that. And they're just like, we got to go do kingdom work. And then Jesus looks at him and he's like, man, that's so cool. Do you want to want to just go sit and hang out? I'd be like, no, Jesus, we got to do something. He's like, no, come and rest with me. Do you ever feel too busy to be with Jesus? Your morning is way too busy. Your afternoon is too busy. Like Sundays are too busy. You got to blitz out right after my sermons, and there's just no way you can spend time like singing, right? 'Cause you're just too busy. And Jesus is like, hey, do you want to come with me? Do you want to rest with me? Because this is the invitation of Jesus. This is the invitation of the book of Esther. When there's ruin, we are allowed rest, and we're supposed to take it very serious. The author of Hebrews actually says, I won't quote it, but the author of Hebrews says that it is our responsibility to enter into his rest. Like it is a requirement. So I want to invite you as we worship and respond today to just rest in Jesus. If that means coming to the front and kneeling, just rest. If that means pleading with him to take off these burdens that are so overwhelming you, then do that. But don't try to earn anything from Jesus today. Just rest. And if you need to today, maybe you need to admit how ruined your life may be so that you can come to him clearly. He's not freaked out by your ruin, by the way, guys. He loves you. So I'm going to pray and then we'll worship together. So let's pray.